Good morning and welcome to this Jeju Forum session on nuclear hotlines and risk reduction, past experiences and lessons from the Asia Pacific. I'm Dr. Tanya Ogilvie-White, Senior Research Advisor to the Asia Pacific Leadership Network and Senior Fellow at Australian National University. I'm glad we're here today to discuss this important subject, not just because hotlines need to be upgraded and augmented and some actually restored, but because talking about them focuses our minds very clearly on the real threat of nuclear war. It's not hyperbole to say that we're living in very dangerous times. And I'd like to thank the Jeju Forum and APLN for highlighting these challenges and for bringing together experts from this region to address them. So to introduce our panel of eminent experts in the order they'll speak, we have Professor Chung-In Moon, Dr. Peter Hayes, Mr. Philip Reiner, and Professor Fan Jisha. Professor Chung-In Moon is chairman of the Sejong Institute in South Korea and vice chairman of APLN. He previously served as the special advisor to the RAK president for unification, foreign and security affairs, and is currently the editor-in-chief of Global Asia. He's co-author of a recent APLN policy brief titled Hotline Between the Two Koreas, Status Limitations and Future Tasks, which is a topic he'll be addressing today. You can find his paper on the APLN website. Our second speaker, Dr. Peter Hayes, he's Research Director at APLN. He's Honorary Professor at the Center for International Security Studies at Sydney University and Executive Director at the Nautilus Institute for Security and Sustainability in Berkeley, California. He's been doing research on the vulnerabilities inherent in NC3 systems for many years and is closely involved in the Catalink initiative, a project exploring the development of a reliable global system to augment current and future nuclear hotlines. Peter will be introducing the subject of NC3 today, explaining some of its weak points and the importance of hotlines and other risk reduction measures. Building on Peter's presentation, Philip Reiner is our third speaker. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute for Security and Technology and previously served as President Obama's Senior Director for South Asia on the US National Security Council. He spent a number of years working in the electronic warfare, remote sensing and vision systems business units at Raytheon. Today, he'll be talking about the role robust communication systems can play in preventing conflict escalation, including the contribution Catalink could make. Finally, Professor Fan Jisha will discuss China's nuclear hotlines with the US, South Korea, India, Vietnam, and Taiwan. Professor Fan is Director of Global Governance at the Institute for International Strategic Studies in the Party School of the Central Committee of the CPC. Previously, he was the Director of the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. So my thanks to all four speakers for joining us today. Let's begin with your presentations. You each have between 5 and 7 minutes. So I will hand over first to Chung-In for your discussion of hotlines between the two Koreas. Thank you.
Tanya, thank you very much for your kind introduction. But as Peter Hayes has been leading this project, and along with Philip, really, hotline is very, very important. It is an important part of the confidence building measures so that we can avoid any kinds of accidental military conflict among parties concerned. In the case of South Korea, we had the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. But after the Korean War, there was no communication with North Korea at all, almost 26 years. It was only in 1971 both sides have agreed to set up hotline, and mostly between the South Korean Intelligence Agency and North Korean counterpart, the Department of the United Front of Korea Workers' Party. But since then on, we were able to set up about 51 hotlines between South Korea and North Korea. We have several hotlines. The most important hotline is Summit Hotline. We have a presidential office, Blue House hotline linked to headquarters of Korea Workers' Party. And it is a Moon Jae-in, Kim Jong-un direct hotline. It was used very usefully. It was utilized very usefully in 2018. 2018, we had Panmunjom Summit. We used that in preparing Panmunjom Summit, and also we used it for the setting up the informal and secret summit between North and South Korea on May 26, 2018, and also September 2018 when we had a Pyongyang summit. Okay, therefore it was very useful, but it is no longer working. Okay. And also we have another hotline. There is an official hotline between our Ministry of Unification and its counterpart, Cho Pyeong-tong, of the North Korean cabinet. Okay, that is very important because that has been used for the preparation of North-South Korean talks, and that was used for humanitarian assistance to North Korea, and for various reasons. And that is what we call official hotline between the North and the South. It is cut up now. Okay, and third, we had most important hotline that is between our National Intelligence Service and its counterpart, the Department of United Front of North Korea. Even before we have an official talk with North Korea through the Ministry of Unification hotline, usual initial contact is arranged through this NIS, National Intelligence Service, and Department of United Front in a contact. That is, I would say, that the most important hotline between the two. Okay. Again, that has been cut up since June 2020, but that was used in September last year, and also I understand that that was used in May this year. Therefore, that line is still alive. Okay, and apart from that, from crisis management point of view, most important hotline is a military hotline. We had the military hotline in the West Sea, and also we had the military hotline in the East Sea. Those are very important in preventing any kinds of crisis escalation on the Korean Peninsula. Okay, and particularly in the West Sea, this military hotline played a very important role, notifying each other any suspicious moves. Okay, and if there is any kinds of accident, we could notify each other so that we could prevent any kinds of conflict escalation. But those two military lines are now cut off. Okay, and apart from that, we had Incheon International Airport has air traffic control in a communication line with the Pyongyang Sunan Airport, but it is purely for the air traffic control. It doesn't have any kinds of so-called communication function between the two. Okay, but that is still working. And finally, it is not the South Korean government's hotline with North Korea, but it is a United Nations Command has a military hotline with North Korea in order to maintain and manage an armistice agreement. That is still working. Therefore, out of 51 hotlines between the North and the South, the most important hotlines are that kinds of hotlines. But as I pointed out, since June 2020, out of all these things, UNC, United Nations Command hotline is still working, NIS hotline working occasionally, but other than that, virtually all the hotlines are stopped. But one of the fundamental problems with the inter-Korean hotline is this. It is so vulnerable and fragile. Okay, if you go back to the European experience of CSC and OSCE, Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, when you talk about, confidence building measures, we start with notification of military exercise, observation of military exercise, and you communicate through the hotlines. Okay, and you can set up crisis control center. You can do exchange of military personnel, intelligence personnel. Even you can go for the redeployment of offensive weapons from the borderline and whatever. But in doing all these CBM activities, the most important thing is hotline. And hotline is a very important stepping stone toward confidence building measures. But in the case of the Korean Peninsula, hotline is a product of confidence building measures. If inter-Korean relations are good, if North Korea and the US relations good, then we can have hotlines, and hotlines functions in very nice way. But if there is any kinds of macro political or security crisis on the Korean Peninsula, instead of utilizing hotline, North Korea cut off hotlines. Therefore, it's a reverse case. Therefore, hotlines on the Korean Peninsula have not been used toward the confidence building measures. On the contrary, it has been product of pre-confidence building measures. Therefore, I would say that it has become extremely vulnerable. Okay. Therefore, now our task is how to really stabilize and routinize inter-Korean hotline, regardless of political and security development on the Korean Peninsula in Northeast Asia. And that will be a very important issue. In fact, our summit, Panmunjom summit in April 2018 and Pyongyang summit in 2018, and two leaders talked about the importance of hotlines. But again, when things things go wrong, then first thing North Korea does is to cut off hotlines. But he's not really cutting up. North Korea is not getting our phone calls. Okay, therefore that is the task is how to stabilize hotlines. Another issue is, as Hotlines Institute and Philip Reiner have been doing it, hold this Catalink issue. And I really see that the relevancy of catastrophe link between North and South Korea too, because particularly North Korean communication system is not very good. But even if we are able to maintain operational hotline, if there is any technical problems or the electric and the outage of electric system, whatever, then there could be breakdown in hotlines. Therefore, if we are able to build some kind of confidence building, confidence with North Korea, what we have to think about is how to can adopt that kind of universalized, the hotline that can prevent a catastrophe. Therefore, we might have something to learn from the case of Catalink. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Chang-in, for your insights into the status of the hotlines between the two Koreas. We'll come back to that subject later in our Q&A. But right now, I'd like to turn to Peter for your discussion of NC3 vulnerabilities and especially the third C, communications. So over to you, Peter. Remember to take your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya, and welcome everyone, including our viewers. It's great to be here. And in 7 minutes, I'm going to introduce what is nuclear command and control communications, which relates closely to the hotline issue. How does it work? Why is it important? And who has it? There are lots of hotlines, it turns out, in the world involving nuclear weapon states. Here's one list from this study by Steve Miller last year, which has, I think, 18 or 19. It's not a complete list. For example, the French, Soviet, now Russian hotline is not on this list, but there are many such hotlines in the world. And it's the problem is these are not harmonized. They use different technology. There are no standards. They often don't work. leaving aside the political problems that Chung-In mentioned as to whether someone at the other end picks up the line. At one end of the spectrum of types of hotline, you have the American archetype, which is the Cold War nuclear command and control intelligence system. That system is set up to run nuclear weapons operations, the command and control function. You make sure you always have them available for use, but never use them in a negative fashion by mistake or inadvertently. And you combine the command and control function with communications to transmit early warning information, to support decision-making, and then to fire or send off the fire or strike orders. And this is all linked to the intelligence system, including early warning sensors. American NC3, as I said, is at one end of the spectrum. The United States has a truly vast global patchwork quilt of over 200 systems. The one on the Air Force, run by the Air Force, are on the left, and the ones on the Navy are on the right. And these are a combination of analog and digital systems. Many of them are interoperable, and the whole system is so complex that whilst it probably works at the moment, no one really fully comprehends how the system itself works. This is matched to some extent by the other great powers with nuclear weapons that have global reach. They are, of course, Russia, that matches the American system on the right. The top left is the Russian early warning system, and then China itself now is emerging rapidly to have full global reach. And how this triangle at the global level interacts constitutes a meta system, the dynamics of which are poorly understood. At the other end of the spectrum is North Korea, which has a very simple nuclear command and control system with one leader at the top, Kim Jong-un, and then below him, the party controllers who sit on top of the warheads, co-located but separated in all probability from the rocket force run by the military. And obviously there is this sequence: release, mate the warheads to the missiles, and fire, that involves a series of commands coming from Kim Jong-un directly to those two different separate elements. And there is a moment of fusion before firing that is quite perilous in terms of control. It's even possible that Kim Jong-un has his own nuclear football, as it's called in the United States, with the operational codes that authenticate his strike orders, or Cheget in the Russian system. This little chap on the left there with the little hat and the briefcase is speculated to be the North Korean nuclear football, or Cheget. So these are the two ends of the spectrum. What matters really is how the two meet in a relationship. And I love this graphic, which shows how Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un fed off each other in their nuclear threat making. It's not how Kim Jong-un sits alone or Donald Trump sits alone, it's how the two interact. And it's the same with the nuclear command and control, communication, and intelligence systems. And in fact, they don't just interact bilaterally. This shows the interaction from the left-hand side of that matrix, following the arrows where states of different kinds of NC3 capacity and resources shift from an emphasis on negative controls to make sure they don't go to nuclear war inadvertently or by accident, using the procedural controls and the technical controls. They all shift in a crisis to the right-hand side to an emphasis on being able to actually fire the nuclear weapons. And they also tend to shift towards procedural and lift technical controls at times of high tension. So they're on trigger happy edge, if you like, in a crisis. And you can see here we have the DPRK, the United States, China, and Russia, all on the move, going from routine management to crisis management. And in this particular image, we also have the whole shift instigated by a terrorist non-state nuclear attack. which might be ambiguous but cause states to perceive the others as being a threat. So what's the problem with NC3? Well, it's vulnerability to attack that induces a conventional or nuclear first strike, possibly due to the entanglement of nuclear and conventional command and control communications and intelligence systems. It's loss of control and inadvertent nuclear war, particularly because people make mistakes with their early warning system. It's accidental nuclear war, especially due to technological failure or arising from the sheer complexity of these systems, which no one really understands fully how they operate. And then finally, in today's context, it's the fact that nuclear war could induce rapid climate change of a truly devastating nature and disable global existential problem solving altogether, for example, in addressing the pandemic effectively. Nuclear war is kind of the bridge between these two other existential crises. So it's really critical that we manage it. In the Cold War, we had about one crisis every 3 years in which NC3 systems played a role, and that's 16 crises overall, including 4 or 5 that were actually in the Northeast Asian region, probably the Keimoe-Matsu crisis in '58, the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62 with the Soviet submarine off Hawaii, and the August '76 DMZ crisis are the 3 most critical ones. But in a pandemic era, we've seen at least 4 out of the 9 supreme nuclear commanders actually come down with COVID, as well as perhaps some of their NC3 forces, as well as the nuclear weapons forces themselves. Another very important issue related to command and control is ensuring that nuclear weapons are consistent with the laws of armed conflict and targeting. And this is an open question because it's such a secretive activity in each country, but this now needs to come to the surface. We find the nuclear commanders and their legal advisors are highly siloed and self-referential in each country. But in the 21st century, it's really time for them to start the conversation and figure out how they cooperate. And hotlines are really a critical way of doing that. And I just will conclude by referring you to this synthesis report on the issue of NC3 systems and the subsequent report called Last Chance on Hotlines. And I'll hand it off here to my colleague, Philip Reiner, to go into greater depth about Catalink and nuclear hotlines.
Yes, so thank you, Peter. I always find it really sobering to listen to experts talk about NC3. And I found your report really insightful, and I recommend that to everybody. So now, as Peter said, Philip is now going to expand on Peter's talk and offer his insights into how a more stable global communication system could be built. Thank you very much, and over to Philip.
So thank you, Tanya, and thank you to APLN for this really unique opportunity. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here to talk about what we think really is an incredibly important piece of the puzzle when it comes to reducing nuclear risk in the 21st century. I'm going to speak to a little bit in further detail to something that Peter had begun to speak about a moment ago, which came out of some conversations that we engendered a couple of years ago. And what I'll do here today is really 2 main things. I will identify in a little bit greater detail what Professor Moon and what Peter have already begun to talk about, which is the real challenge of crisis communications in the NC3 context. And then I will go into some detail on the potential Catalink solution to this challenge. This is not a new problem. And something I always like to start this talk off with is to hark back to really one of the seminal texts when it comes to understanding the challenges posed when thinking about nuclear operations, and looking back to what Ash Carter and John Steinbrunner and Charles Zarakis wrote about really back decades ago in the 80s, where they noted the often overlooked element of thinking about what command and control systems needed to take into account, which was we've focused so much of our time, energy, and effort and our resources on making sure that a command goes from a leader to a nuclear commander on the ground who may have to execute said command. But we do not spend as much time thinking about how states who are actually potentially going to go to war with one another, how they communicate with each other at that moment of crisis. And even more dangerously, how they may communicate with each other after an actual exchange has occurred. So what we've been thinking about is this requirement, which is that leaders of nuclear weapon states often do not have a direct, simple, secure communication capability to be able to speak with one another. There are no multilateral hotlines in the world today, as another data point. And as Peter had begun to speak of, when it comes to NC3 and how these systems work in the world today, conventional and nuclear communication systems are very much entangled. And those are the systems, I think, as everyone on this call understands, in the lead up to or at the moment of a kinetic conflict, those are the systems that get targeted first. So what do you have that's in place so that those leaders of those nuclear weapon states can actually still communicate with each other if and when their systems have been degraded, whether on purpose or on accident? The requirement therein is for a simple, secure, dedicated, solely for the use of these sorts of communications, reliable and robust system that's really meant for that dedicated communication between the leaders of nuclear weapon states in the lead up to, in other words, to prevent an actual crisis, or in the midst of, that gives them the capability to actually communicate with each other in the midst of a crisis. The highest priority here is not to give one an advantage over the other. It's not to necessarily alleviate political challenges between two nation states. It's to actually decrease the risk of a nuclear conflict with a very tangible solution. This solution was derived from a workshop that Peter and ourselves hosted a while back, and this was back in 2019 now. And the attempt at that time, as Peter began to speak of a moment ago, was to look at all NC3 systems around the world and to think about, in the 21st century, what are the challenges posed in that context? When you think about emerging technologies, when you think about cyber vulnerabilities, when you think about the integration of artificial intelligence and deep learning capabilities into our communication systems, what is that going to mean for what is now a multipolar nuclear reality? We had incredible input as part of that discussion from experts from around the world to talk about all of those NC3 systems. But what was really intriguing about it was we were able to pull people in from Silicon Valley who could speak to some of the technical evolutions that we can expect are going to impact these systems going forward. One of the individuals who joined that conversation, you see the name of his paper, which is available on our website for those who are interested. It's called Security at Extreme Scales. And this is Eric Gross, who was the former head of security at Google, security and privacy at Google, for a number of years. And what was really fascinating in his presentation was his assertion that it's possible to consider how to develop a more secure, simple, and reliable thin line that could potentially be available to all leaders of nuclear weapon states. And so this is the endeavor that we have embarked upon over the course of the last couple of years, is to build this solution that we have come to call Catalink. And this is essentially a 21st century hotline system. And it's one that is intentionally international in its essence, at its core. This is something that's being designed in order to avert catastrophe and avert conflict between two nations. But really at its core, it's derived out of a technical effort that has international buy-in from the very beginning. This concept is very simple, and that's on purpose. We're simply talking about a device that leader can actually rely upon, that is secure and that is robust, and that is, again, that dedicated communication capability between two leaders, that has a system that it can fall back on if and when other communications networks are degraded or aren't available to it. So the little device that we refer to, we call it the puck, and the system that it would ride on, as you see there in the longer version, the Resilient Omni-Frequency Crisis Communication System, we simply call the ROCs. And this would be a global mesh network that can be relied upon if and when communication systems are degraded in a crisis. What sets this apart? What's most useful to think about as you consider the various parameters of what would make a system like this useful? We would assert one of the most important pieces of this is radical simplicity, is actually looking at, and I think everyone who's listening to this conversation is well aware of the fact that cyber systems are vulnerable systems. And so what we would assert is you have to go back to the actual silicon. You have to go back to the actual firmware and hardware that this is built from and build it from the bottom up. And that you can do this in a way so that it's trustworthy. And so that everyone who's involved in the process, again, in an international setting, everyone is involved in the process from the very beginning to be able to actually test that code and to make sure it does what it's supposed to do. One of the pieces of this that's absolutely most critical to it is this idea of formal methods. Formal methods is the mathematical approach that will actually take what is supposed to happen with a system, whether software or hardware, and use mathematical proofs to show that it does what it's supposed to do. That provides an additional layer of integrity and confidence in the system that you're designing. Again, the backup system that we would propose be part of this is what creates the resilience that's necessary so that leaders know that this is a system that's available to them at a moment of crisis. That's that global mesh network that I talked about just a moment ago. This would provide multiple pathways so that the communication between those two leaders, even in a moment of crisis where there may be a kinetic exchange, that message still gets through. Finally, the fact that we would do this through open source design. This is where you're actually at an international level able to build in trust so that you have people who are involved in the development of the code from the very beginning who are from potentially antagonistic nations. But their folks, their technical folks, can actually work together to test out the code, work on it together, and actually ensure that it provides the trust and integrity that's necessary for such incredibly sensitive communications. The question always arises is how do you do this? Who should be involved in the conversation? What we would assert is that absolutely the states with nuclear weapons have to be involved from the outset, all of them, in order to make sure that this is developed with the integrity that's necessary so that it will be adopted by the states that are going to need it the most. That being said, non-nuclear weapon states, neutral parties are going to need to be a part of this conversation as well to help convene, to help provide neutral platforms for conversation, and to, at the end of it, help shepherd the technical conversation forward in a trustworthy manner. At the end of the day, this has got to be a global collaborative effort. It's centered around this notion of open source systems, and the project team itself is already an international group of folks who are talking about this from Australia, India, Europe, United States, and we continue to expand that group of technically savvy individuals who are part of this conversation. One of the other questions that often arises is in what scenarios can you imagine this actually being applicable? The list is really endless. And we can apply this to the East Asian context. We can apply this to the South Asian context. We can apply this to the European. You can think about it through the lens of dyadic adversarial scenarios. You can think about it in a multipolar scenario as well. You think about a situation where India, China, and Pakistan may be in a crisis situation. There does not currently exist a means for them to communicate directly with one another. The attempt here would be to be able to put something on the table so that they could. There is, for example, existing hotlines, as I think Dr. Moon was referring to earlier, but those existing hotlines are vulnerable. They're fragile. I think an example that I am very familiar with is the India-Pakistan DGMO hotline. It is not one that is turned to in crisis. That is not a hotline that is relied upon for anything more than simple exchanges of information. That is not what you need to avoid a nuclear exchange. The US-China defense communication links that exist, I think there was a very relevant and recent article in Foreign Policy magazine here in the United States that spoke of this, how often when that phone rings out, it rings out to an empty room. This is a significant challenge, and I think this was what Dr. Moon was referring to earlier, that sometimes even when you do have these links in place, how do you get adoption? We think that if you had this very simple technical means called Catalink, that it may actually improve confidence. It may actually improve that political willingness to engage and utilize a solution like this. Again, I think as has already been elucidated here, I don't need to emphasize it any further. Having hotlines in place creates opportunities for collaboration, and therein creates opportunities for crisis reduction, that reducing that risk of a potential nuclear conflict. Really appreciate, again, the opportunity to be here today and speak of Catalink, and I look forward to the question and answer period and in talking about this further.
Thank you very much for that, Philip. I must say, I find the Catalink project ambitious, probably one of the most important projects that I've heard discussed, and most timely as well. So, I mean, there are lots of challenges associated with it, which we'll come back to in the Q&A. I don't think we need to really say too much more about that right now. I'll pass on instead. I did let you overrun, Philip, because I just thought that all of that was important explanation and background that we all needed. So now let's move on to Fan Jise, who is now going to talk about China's nuclear hotlines, which is something we don't often hear about. So I'm very much looking forward to your presentation. Thank you, Professor Fan.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Tanya. And I also want to thank APLN and Jeju for organizing this event and to talk about this very important topic. Today, I want to share my view about the China and the nuclear hotlines. I will talk about mainly 4 points. The first one is about the old context of nuclear hotlines. And the second is about the new reality and its relevance to the nuclear hotline. And the third point is about China approach. And finally, about the future of nuclear hotline for China. I think the nuclear hotline is mostly a Cold War product. It was developed in the context of Cold War. At that time, you understand the Soviet Union, they define the role of nuclear weapon as a weapon to win a war, a conventional one or a nuclear one. And they have fierce arms race. They develop many different types of nuclear weapons, and they maintain a very large nuclear arsenal. And also they deploy the nuclear weapons in their own countries and in bases in allied countries as well. They maintain the nuclear weapons at a very high alert level. So that's the context for the nuclear hotlines. So there's high chance of miscalculation, misperception, and accidental and unauthorized use of nuclear weapons. Then there's Cuban Missile Crisis. And that at that time, there's limited and low efficient communication between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the risk of nuclear war is real. So it's necessary after the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's necessary for both sides to build up a nuclear hotline, just to ensure that quick, reliable, secure, accurate, and authoritative interactions were possible between the highest levels of government in the event of an emergency or crisis or war. So that hotline in the context of the Cold War, it worked for both, and in that time and after the end of the Cold War. But now we are facing a new reality. we need to check whether it's still applicable for China. And with the end of the Cold War, I think the context has changed dramatically. For example, there's economic globalization, and that produced economic interdependence. And then there's diplomatic cooperation and coordination among major nuclear powers over many regional issues, like the one in Korean Peninsula. And between the major nuclear powers, there's no hostility similar to the ones between United States and Soviet Union in Cold War era. So overall, the context have changed dramatically. And for China, in terms of nuclear policies, and we China define nuclear as a weapon for self-defense only. And we made a commitment of no first use, negative security assurance, and also we indicated that we do not have any interest in arms race. Ever since 1964, we maintain a very small nuclear arsenal and maintain a low alert level. And then there's no deployment of nuclear weapons outside of China. So nuclear is a very local issue in China foreign policy. And other than that, we have many existing channels for communication. So that's the new context for nuclear hotline and for the case of China. And how we deal with this issue, I think that China approach is very different from other countries because, after 1964, China was not involved in any significant nuclear crisis, which is similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis, certainly other than the one in 1969. And then in China foreign policy, nuclear is a very local issue. We do not want to define our relationship in terms of nuclear. And so as a result, China did not sign any nuclear hotline agreement with any country in the last several decades. But we do have our own purse in building up companies. We have our own purse in companies building measures, and we maintain our nuclear policy remain largely unchanged for several decades. And we have the no first use commitment, and we proposed for an agreement on no first use among nuclear powers. And we also have a sort of, a non-targeting agreement with Russia, which was signed in 1994. And we have signed that agreement with the United States in 1998. That agreement was reaffirmed in 2009. And also we have the P5 joint statement on non-targeting agreement and on notification of ballistic missile and civilian vehicle launches with Russia as well. So we have our own way to build up our confidence among nuclear powers. As to the nuclear hotlines, we do not have, even though we do not have any nuclear hotlines, but we do have many hotlines with many countries. We sign agreements with other countries just to, it's not nuclear specific. It's not necessarily an arrangement for communicating at the highest level either. We just sign agreements on hotlines with countries to deal with different, defensive and security issues. It's overall hotline for China is an indicator of general state of bilateral relationship in a positive state. So that's the case for China. And to the future for China, China policy and approach may not change anytime soon. I mean, how we deal with that issue, how we handle that issue in our foreign policy. But in order to manage the nuclear component in our relationship with other countries, China is willing to add the nuclear issue to a broad agenda, such as what we had did in the past. Like, for example, in 2011, China and the United States, set up a new dialogue. That's a strategic security dialogue, and the strategic and economic dialogue, which cover the cyber, the nuclear, the missile defense, and the space. So nuclear is part of a broad agenda. We approach in that way. In the future, certainly it may be in China's interest to build up to sign agreement with other countries on the nuclear hotlines, only because it's desirable. The insurance policy, as indicated by Steve Miller, in an emergency, it could serve as an escape valve and also an off ramp from road to disaster. So, as a insurance policy, China may be willing to set up a nuclear hotline in the future. So basically, that's China's approach. We do business in a way very different from other nuclear countries. That's why, at this moment, we do not have any real nuclear hotlines, but we do have a hotline on other defense and security issues. So I will stop here. Thank you, Ms. Tanya.
Thank you so much, Professor Fan. That was really very interesting, and I actually learned a lot from your talk. And I think one point I would just make is that, and I think you were really coming to that at the end of your talk, is that it doesn't matter how benign a country thinks its intentions are, or how benign relative to other nuclear weapon states it might think its nuclear doctrine is, it can still be misinterpreted and intentions can be misunderstood. And I see the role of hotlines really fills that gap, including for China. So yeah, I think the nuclear hotline issue is going to become more and more important in the years ahead. So thank you very much for that very excellent presentation. And what I'd like to do now is I have a few questions for you all, for all our speakers. And I'd like to actually start off with a general one. So this is for all of you. And I would say that one of the biggest challenges associated with creating and sustaining robust hotlines is their vulnerability to the whims of individual decision makers. And Chang-in was really talking about that in his presentation. So even if we overcome many of the technical challenges involved in updating hotlines, how do we deal with the tendency for hotlines to be deliberately severed during times of tension? So I know that's a difficult question. So this is, shall I put it to, I'll put it to Chang-in first, I suppose.
When you talk about hotline between the summit, it is so elaborate. In order to have the hotline talks between the two leaders, then there is about 2 to 3 days prior preparation for all those things. There is no such thing as abrupt communication. Therefore, it is, it goes through the protocol issues and, the agenda set up earlier and etc. But at the time of crisis, okay, the hotline will be much more important. But we do not have a manual for that kinds of the usage of hotline at the time of crisis, because to my understanding, there is no such a thing as hotline communication at the time of crisis other than military level or intelligence level. But particularly when you talk about the summit level, it is very, very difficult. Okay, therefore it is very important, for you to come up with, there are many different types of hotlines. Okay, and there must be some kinds of manual for different levels of hotlines among the adversarial parties, and that should be one of the first measures to work out among those parties. I don't know whether I answered your question or not. Therefore, when you talk about so-called the summit level hotline, everything is prearranged. Okay.
Yeah.
But it is very rare, at least in the Korean case, the leaders never used the hotline at the time of crisis. Military, Ministry of Unification, our intelligence could have used them. But usually at the time of crisis, they tend to turn off everything.
Right, which is exactly when it's most needed. So I agree with you, a manual would be a good idea. But just coming back to you, Chang-in, because I had a question for you later, which we could address now actually, which is, as you discussed, many of the hotlines between the two Koreas have been cut, and a number of them were cut last year, important ones. What do you think it would take for those to be re-established? restored? What would it take?
In Korean context, the United States should send some positive signal to Pyongyang. Okay, if they come out, if they reopen communication and come out dialogue, they have something to gain. Then they will start to open. In other words, the hotline is being extremely instrumental. If they have something to gain, they may open up. If there's nothing to gain, they turn off.
Thank you, Chung-In. So would any of our other speakers like to answer that question, or shall I move on?
Tanya, I'm happy to have a go at what you could call the whimsical or abusive use of hotlines. And generally, I think you can say in conflict relationships, which is sort of a matter of sociology, all conflicts are a relationship at all times, and that requires communication. Now, the question is, in a conflict, is it better to have silence, no communication because there's no channel, or is it better to have silence, which is assumed to be a deliberate signal? Not getting someone picking up when you call is actually information. Of course, if the line is broken and cut off because a farmer plowed up the hotline, which actually happened with the US-Soviet hotline when it was first constructed, is a different kind of silence that if it coincided with a crisis would be a real problem. But in a crisis which is veering towards war, the fact that the other party is using their hotline to signal their displeasure or their refusal to communicate can mean a variety of things which you can interpret. It might mean that they're willing to take more risk, so you better back off. Or it might mean that they're going to use other channels and other third parties. They're not willing to talk to you directly. But it is information that you don't get if you don't have a hotline. So I would argue in general, having a hotline will provide you more information in a crisis that you need than not having a hotline, even if it's used in a whimsical or abusive fashion. And this would have been very clear in August of 1976, which was perhaps the closest to nuclear war that this region has come since the end of World War II, when the United States moved nuclear weapons into the demilitarized zone at the time of cutting down the poplar tree over which a couple of Americans died at the hands of some North Koreans. And the United States and South Korea sent a task force in to cut down the poplar tree. Now, at the time, the American general in charge had pre-delegated authority to use artillery north of the DMZ and in effect declare war on his own with North Korea, which would have almost certainly escalated to the use of that nuclear artillery that was then within range of North Korea's artillery in the demilitarized zone. I think if the then president of the United States had had a hotline with then leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, we might have actually had a much less risk-taking episode in August of 1976. And I think if President Biden would have proposed to Kim Jong-un that they need not so much a summit, but a hotline, it could be a low-level but very important way of moving forward the political agenda at this point. So hotlines can serve many roles. I think there is a current opportunity there for the Biden administration if they want to take it. So I'll stop there with those observations.
Thank you, Peter. That was really interesting. I always like your insights because you always tend to think laterally across issues. So yes, the silence can be interpreted in different ways and has a role and a function in itself. But I'd like to actually ask a question to Jeju, if it's okay with you. Something that Peter has started talking about is the abuse of hotlines, and I've seen some debate recently over what was called the weaponization of hotlines, which I think is a really unhelpful term, actually, but something, seeing as it is being discussed, that I think we could probably address here. And I wondered if you had could give your perspective on that debate.
I think hotline is, is one way to communicate in a crisis scenario. You had better to communicate in a frank and a candid way, but not necessarily to, to weaponize that, to send out warning signals. That may not be conducive for crisis management. And that line may face a threat to be cut off. If you want to send out the warning signals to threat the other side, you better send out, to communicate rather than to, threaten the other side. The other side could get the message. And then if you want to threaten, and they may choose not to, not to communicate. And this is relevant to the last question you raised. That is, for example, in some cases that some hotline could be cut off. Why? I think there are 2 points to make. The first one is that, the structured culture may come into play in the crisis management. The leader do not want to make decisions very rapidly. They want to slow down. They want to get more information and then make a decision. And secondly, the bureaucratic structure matters a lot. In the case of the United States, in the last 4 years, we see that President Trump, that's his style, his way. But in other, especially Asian countries, in the case, for example, in the case of China, according to the white paper, it's the CMC, the Central Military Committee made a decision which is related to nuclear issues. So it's not one person, it's a group of people. So the decision-making structure is very different. So in the case of the hotline, different countries may have different scenarios. Certainly, as one channel to communicate, it has a merit, it has an advantage, but it's not one way to send out the threatening message to outside. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jisa. Actually, what I was getting at was in the debate is whether they could be used in a sort of a way to trick the opponent by providing false information or creating deliberate delays. But I mean, actually, I don't actually find that debate particularly helpful myself. Given how important it is how important communication is in building confidence, I'm glad that we're mostly focusing on that today. So I actually want to come back to the question of the Catalink, developing the Catalink proposal further, because I see huge merit in it. And I actually think it's an urgent project. I don't know what its status is at the moment. I know in one of the recent reports I saw, it was still looking for funding, quite significant funding. And I hope that has been secured to take it forward. But my question actually now to Peter and Philip, to get that proposal off the ground, you're right, you need to have the nuclear armed states, including adversaries, working in a very practical way on developing that initiative from the ground up. That requires getting buy-in early on at a time when there is very little trust. How is that going to be secured? What is the level of interest in the proposal when you're talking about it with different countries and different experts in different regions? What is the level of interest that you've found, and what do you think needs to be done to take it further? So those questions to Peter and Philip. Well, let's say Philip.
Sure, and I think in part this will also answer some of the other questions that just came up. I think when looking at some of the challenges, for instance, that could be created by malicious intent, Tanya, per what you were just speaking to in terms of weaponizing these sorts of systems, the Catalink system itself would actually take advantage of cutting edge technologies in order to try to alleviate some of that. Actually using, if you're all familiar, a key exchange between the two leaders that would actually verify who is actually going to be on the other end of that system, that would actually remove some of that level of concern. Obviously, there's still going to have to be some discretion utilized when relying on a system like this, because you can't see one another, perhaps. But the whole idea is to actually imbue it with trust by using technical means to try and help shore that up. I think at the core of it, the conversations that we've engendered so far have been fairly positive. We have a recent conversation that has really kind of taken on a great level of optimism and positive trajectory, which is with the Swiss government stepping in and both politically and from a resource perspective supporting the Catalink initiative. And I think that's incredibly important as we think about this as not an American idea and not an Australian idea. This is an idea that really needs to bring as many people into it from the international community as possible from the beginning. So we've actually had a very open door with this. We've been reaching out to as many people as we can to think about how to actually get that technical buy-in from the outset. So we've begun conversations with folks in India and in Pakistan with positive reception. We've been talking to folks in the UK and in France. We've been speaking with folks who are based in Moscow, and we've begun the process to reach out to folks who are in East Asia as well. So far, the conversation has been very positive. Some of the resources you alluded to earlier, Tanya, have begun to come in. Obviously, we're not going to turn down any further resources if anyone wants to offer them. I would argue, though, that when, for instance, the NATO Innovation Board reaches out and says, what all are you working on? And what opportunities might this create? And so we're having the opportunity to go brief NATO at the Deputy Secretary General level. I think the opportunity exists here to really to get that political buy-in early on in the process and to get the technical experts from each place. So we've been talking to folks in the open source community in Russia, talking folks in the open source community in China, talking folks to the open source community really in Europe. Those are the people who need to be involved very early in the process to imbue it with to your question, with the technical integrity and trust from the very beginning. I could keep talking. I'll restrain myself. There is historical precedent for doing this. If you have questions about that sort of thing, you look at the AES encryption standard competition, which allowed for everyone in the world to compete to try and derive this technical solution. Everyone relies on it today. It is the underpinning of public key cryptography. It's what we all rely on to use the internet and to conduct business on the internet. That was an open process. So this can be done from a technical perspective.
Thank you very much, Philip. Now you've all actually answered a question now, and you've all answered them really well and really clearly. So I think as we've slightly overrun, we should bring the session to an end. And I would just like to end by saying that I think very often when we talk about nuclear threats or nuclear weapons in general, we talk about them in very abstract ways. We talk about nuclear deterrence in very abstract ways, in ways that isn't very meaningful to a lot of people. But when you start talking about hotlines and communications and the final decision-making process that could lead to war, including an accidental nuclear war, I think it really drives home the reality of nuclear threats and the reality of the very dangerous multipolar nuclear-armed world we're living in. And so I think it's been a really, really useful discussion, trying to come up with some practical ways of risk mitigation in this very rapidly evolving, risk-prone world that we live in. So I'd like to thank you all. All of your talks were excellent, and you all made an effort to answer my questions. And you all spoke about what is actually quite a technical issue in ways that the non-expert could understand. So I thank you for that as well. So thank you to all. Thank you to Jejuforum for putting this very important topic on your agenda. And thank you to APLN as well. Thank you all and goodbye.
Thank you.